Good morning and welcome to the Maritime Law Lecture Series. And in this particular lesson, we are looking at the law of salvage. Salvage, as we know, means to save something. In this particular case, it is saving um, life, maritime life, life at sea, or maybe property out at sea. Now, this particular unit or this particular module might be particularly useful if you are studying law at the postgraduate level at the university, or you have some links with the maritime industry. Maybe you're a part of an insurance lawyer, or maybe you're interested in chartering ships or anything to do with the maritime industry. So this particular unit, we are looking at what is the law of salvage, and particularly when does salvage apply under common law. Okay, so we'll make a start, and as just like anything else in law, there are some legal tests. And in order for us to prove that there has been an act of salvage, we'll have to prove that there has been four things. First of all, there has been success, the, and the act we are saying is voluntary. There is a maritime property involved in it, and of course there was a danger or there was a peril out at sea. In other words, there was a hurricane, or there was a fire, or there was an act of collision, or similar other instances which constitute a peril. Okay, so let us make a start and look at the first part of this test, which is success. Now, salvage is very synonymous to success. That means in order to claim for a salvage reward, you must make sure that there is success. Now, let me try and explain this to you in very simple terms. Let's say you have a pet cat by the name of Tom, and one fine day you find that Tom goes missing. And you look everywhere. You look in your garden, you look in your shed, you walk to your nearby park and look everywhere. You even drop a little note to your neighbor's letterbox, and say, look, have you found Tom? Please let me know. And if you find Tom, I might give you a reward. And luckily enough, after a couple of days, you find a little boy comes up to your doorstep, and in his hand is your favorite cat, Tom. You're delighted. You're extremely pleased. You find Tom is all right. Everything is fine. And the little boy says, "I found him hiding in my behind my bushes in my garden, and I brought him in. He was a bit scared, and I fed him milk for the last 2 days, and I looked after him, and he's fine." And you're also delighted that Tom is fine. He looks well. He's all right, and he's happy to see you again. So what you decide to do is you decide to give the little boy a reward. You give him £10 because your cat is still alive. So, and it's absolutely a live cat. The cat is still living absolutely fine. That is meant by success. Now, if I translate this into shipping terms, what does it mean? Well, let's have a look. We have a big ship, and this particular ship, let's say, had a bit of a problem in the middle of the sea. It's lost its engines, it's lost its power in the middle of the sea, and the engineers are not on board, cannot fix it. And in the middle of the sea, you cannot really have services of the AA or the RAC. You break down, you break down. You got to fix it. You got to do things yourself. And if they couldn't fix the engine pretty quickly enough, what might happen? Well, water might go in, or it might be driven to the rocks, and the vessel might be a complete loss. So what happens? This particular tug, which happened to be in the area, goes there, puts a few lines across, and brings the vessel safely back into port. So the vessel is now preserved. So in other words, this particular tug has now conducted a very successful operation. In other words, it has been successful. All right. So in the first instance, what we have to prove that there has been a degree of success in the salvage operation. Because otherwise, if there's no success, Unfortunately, we'll have to say that there is no salvage. Right. Second one, voluntary. Okay. Your actions must be purely that of a volunteer. In other words, you're walking down the road, whistling, listening to your nice music on the iPad. Something you see on the other side of the road is happening, and all of a sudden you jump in and you try and help. That's what I mean by a volunteer. Now, again, giving a very simple example of the little boy. Let's say you're walking down the road and you find this little boy hanging from a tree. What was he doing up in a tree? We don't really know. Maybe he was up in the tree chasing cats, maybe chasing squirrels, or maybe picking up a fruit from a tree. So he goes up to a tree. We shouldn't really be climbing trees, um, particularly if you're not good at it. So he's been climbing trees and he's got stuck and he's hanging from a tree and he's shouting, "Help, help." Well, strictly speaking, are you really required to help? Well, what you can do is, you can pick up the phone and maybe call the fire brigade, and within 3 minutes they'll be there. That's their job, the emergency services. Strictly speaking, you're not really required. The law doesn't really require you to go and help. If you want, obviously, we would expect you to go and help, but strictly speaking, you're not really required to help. The fact that if you do go there and if you do help, you're purely going there as a volunteer. You didn't have to go, but the fact that you went there was purely the act of a volunteer. So that's the idea of concept of something which is voluntary in nature. Now let us try and apply that same knowledge onto a shipping case. In this particular example, it's a ship. It's a ship called the San Demetrio, a big, massive oil tanker. Now, all of you must have seen these oil tankers. They bring in a lot of oil into a country, and that's what drives our Esso garages, BP garages, Shell garages, Exxon garages, and so on and so forth. Now, this particular oil tanker happened to catch fire, which obviously is not really a nice thing, especially when you're out at sea. So, obviously, the ship's captain and the crew tried their best to fight the fire. They did everything what they possibly could do, but unfortunately, the fire got worse. And then the captain of the ship or the master of the ship called the crew to abandon the ship, and he gave a command, abandon ship. And all the crew members went into their respective lifeboats, and then they launched the lifeboats. And the lifeboats then went a little further away from the sea, from the ship, which was on fire. And obviously, people in the lifeboat were now waiting to be rescued. Now, all of you must have watched the Titanic at some point, so you can imagine a lot of people in a lifeboat, but instead of multiple lifeboats, we had only one lifeboat full of people, the ship's crew, because obviously the ship wasn't carrying any passengers; it was only crew members. So they were waiting to be rescued. And obviously, I mean, rescue doesn't happen, all of a sudden. Ships or aircrafts or helicopters will have got to go out pretty much into the middle of the sea and pick them up. And obviously, it's a matter of days. Now, these people were waiting in the lifeboats. Now, as they were waiting, they found out probably the next day that the fire had now subsided, gone down. So instead of just waiting in the lifeboat, waiting to be rescued, what the crew members decided to do, a bit heroic in a sense, they decided to reboat their ship. They decided to go back on the San Demetrio, which they had left or abandoned. And once they were on the ship, they went back to the engine room, fixed the engines, got everything going, and took the vessel to a nearby port, what we would call a port of refuge. And at the port of refuge, they claimed salvage. In other words, they are claiming a reward, a 10% the value of the property which they have saved. And the question for the court now to answer is, can they claim salvage? Were their acts as volunteers? Did they act voluntarily? Now, the big question is, obviously, they're crew members of the ship. They're supposed to be looking after the ship at all times. How can they claim salvage? But the question is, the judge pointed out, the time, the occasion when the master or the captain of the ship gave the order to abandon the ship and to go onto a lifeboat, at that point in time, their employment contract with the company, with the shipping company, had ceased, no longer ceased to exist. There's no connection between the shipping company and the crew members. Now they were on the lifeboat. They were in the lifeboat. They were waiting to be rescued by the rescue services. But instead of waiting, they went back on the ship. Going back on the ship was purely the act of going back as a volunteer. So in this particular case, they were entitled to claim a salvage reward, which again goes to show the act must be voluntary. In other sense, there must be no pre-existing obligation to do what you have done. You're going down in the road, whistling, and all of a sudden you jump in and you try and help someone who is in a bit of a trouble. So that's what I mean by volunteer. All right. So your act must be successful, and secondly, it must be of a volunteer. Okay, let us move on and see what else we have to prove. The third thing which we have to prove, that this is a maritime property which you have saved. And typically, this would only apply to things which are floating at sea, typically ships, one of the biggest things, because the law of salvage is exclusive to the shipping industry. So we can extend the definition of ships, maybe perhaps sometimes to seaplanes. If they land in water and if they landed in a bit of trouble and you went in and you give them some form of assistance and you have been successful, obviously you will be entitled to claim salvage because that can be still be argued as maritime property. Or maybe sea harriers taking off from a aircraft carrier and you happen to save a sea harrier, or maybe a helicopter which normally lands and takeoffs from an aircraft carrier. You might be able to argue that at the most, belonging to the sea, maritime property. But what you probably may not be able to argue, in case if you saved uh, a Bentley, if you're in the motorway or in the freeway and you find that a Bentley has broken down, you go in and tow the Bentley to the nearest exit, and then you hold on to the Bentley and ask the owner a 10% reward for saving the Bentley. Unfortunately, you will not be able to claim salvage on a Bentley because the Bentley is not really a maritime property. Okay, and there has been some instances where aircrafts have ditched normal aircrafts into the river Hudson, and you have tug owners going in and trying to save the fuselage of the aircraft, whatever is floating around, and then they have tried to claim salvage, but unfortunately their claims have not been successful because they were ordinary planes. Had they been seaplanes, the outcome might have been something different. But the point which I'm trying to illustrate here is what you have saved must be exclusively belonging to the seas. Unfortunately, road and rail will not be taken into account. All right. So, step three, you have to prove that the property which you have saved is a maritime property. And finally, the last thing which we have to look at is peril, which means the property which you had saved out at sea was involved in some degree of danger, which I mean hurricanes, tropical revolving storms, high seas, wind, fire, or a ship involved in a collision, that kind of bad stuff which you normally encounter at sea. So, if that element is present, of course, you can claim salvage out at sea. Now, if I can give you maybe an example based on this, let's say lovely Sunday afternoon, you go on, take a walk to a local marina, lots of yachts tied up nicely alongside. You decide to go up to a particular yacht, you cast off the ropes forward, you cast off the ropes aft, and then take it somewhere else. And then you tell the owner of the yacht, look, I've saved your yacht. I'm exercising a lien or a charge on the yacht, and I will not give you back the yacht unless you pay me 10% of the property. Oh, I'm sorry, that argument will not stand in court because the yacht was perfectly marooned, perfectly tied up alongside, and had no problem whatsoever. There was no peril which was operating. So you may not be able to claim salvage on that. But you can compare this incident maybe to something else. For example, Sunday afternoon, you go out into your local marina, take out your yacht, go outside for a nice little spin, and let's say the weather becomes a little bad, becomes a little rough, force 7, force 8, the kind of force where the winds starts really picking up and the sea starts swelling up to a couple of meters. And in that kind of sea condition, you find that there is a boat which is drifting in the vicinity. So what do? You go up to the boat and climb aboard, and then no one is on board. You tie up the boat safely and you tow the boat safely back into port, and then you try and claim salvage on the on the boat. So if we go back and try and apply the test, first of all, is there success? Yes, of course, you can argue that there is success because you've managed to tow the boat back into port. Of course, you can say it has been successful and the boat is still intact. Secondly, was it voluntary? Of course, it is voluntary. The fact you boarded the vessel, the boat, was purely that of a volunteer because you didn't really have to do it. You just went in and you did it. Voluntary. Third, was it a maritime property? Of course, we can say that boats, yachts, they are maritime property. So the fact that you went out and saved a maritime property gives you the entitlement to salvage. The third step. Fourth step, was there a peril? Of course, we can say there was a peril because the wind had picked up. It had become force 7, force 8. If you probably didn't go in and intervene, what might have happened? The yacht might be taking in water because of heavy rolling, or the yacht might be drifting ashore, driven to the rocks, and becoming a total loss. So the fact that you intervene and stop the boat from being completely written off is the act of salvage. So now you can go back to your owners and say, look, owners, I have saved your yacht from being completely written off. Here's your boat back, nice and safe. Can I please have 10% the value of the yacht? And obviously, in that case, the owner will be obliged to pay you 10% the value of the yacht because otherwise the boat would have been completely lost. Now, had this boat been worth a couple of millions, there you can work yourself out. 10% of a couple of millions is a lot of money. So, in fact, if you are a boat owner, if you do go out to sea and you save something which was drifting, well, you've earned yourself a bit of money there. Right. So, let's have a little gentle recap. In order for us to have a successful salvage operation, you must prove that there is success. You must prove that the act is completely voluntary. Step 3, you must prove that there was a maritime property. And lastly, there was a degree of peril, or in other words, danger. So once you've established all of these things, you have an automatic right to salvage. And it gives you a 10% the value of the property. You do not need to have a contract. You do not need to have any agreement. The law of the sea automatically gives you that particular right, the common law. Okay, right. Finally, I'll leave you with a question. Um, you might have heard about the Costa Concordia. A year or so ago, it was a big passenger ship which sank off the coast of Italy. A few lives were lost. And the question is now, they obviously carried out a salvage operation. Was it worth it? That's a big question. Because what the owners actually saved up was a bit of metal, not a bit of metal, it was actually a ship which had sunk. It got the ship upright and then it towed back to a port of safety, and then they decide to scrap it. The question is, why did they do it? Okay, they could have easily cut the ship into pieces where it was and carried the pieces back. But why did they decide to get the ship upright and bring it back? What was the whole exercise? Okay, I'll leave you to it. Have a little think around. Perhaps you might be wishing to think along the direction of the perception of the cruise industry in the eyes of the people who constantly take in a cruise. So whether you're cruising with Royal Caribbean or Cunard, or Princess Cruises, so all of it is relevant, isn't it? So why did they do it? Why did they go out and pick a ship which was already sunk, already at the pretty much at the bottom of the sea? Why did they pick it up and bring it back? That's the main question. All right. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon.